His name was Veridon once. That name belonged to a different face. The face was gone now. The medical chamber hummed quietly around Darth Malgus. Small room, narrow viewport. The kind of light that has no opinion about anything. He sat on the edge of the cot with his hands on his knees and did not move. The respirator breathed for him. In, then out. In, then out. Each cycle identical to the one before it. Mechanical. Precise. Nothing like the way a living thing breathes, with its small variations, its hesitations, its unconscious adjustments. This was something else. Something that did not need him to remember. He sat with the sound and tried to decide what he thought about it. He had not yet decided. The medic who entered was young, human. Her face had learned to perform calm as a professional requirement. She moved to the monitoring station, checked the readings, made her notation. Then she turned and saw that he was already looking at her. She adjusted, barely. A small recalibration of breath. The body's honest response when it expects one thing and receives another. "Is there anything you need, my lord?" she asked. Malgus looked at her for 3 full seconds. "No," he said. His voice came through the respirator differently than it had ever come through anything before. The same registers, the same weight, but filtered, translated from something private into something transmittable. In the translation, something small had been left behind. He could not name what it was. The medic nodded and left. He allows himself one memory from the battle, only one. Not the descent to Alderaan's surface, not the Republic forces breaking along the eastern ridge, not even the moment the Jedi appeared, young, bright, burning, with the specific rawness of someone whose power has not yet learned to be careful. One moment. The Force push. It was not a technique. Trained techniques have shape, form, direction, intention. What Satele Shan released on that battlefield had none of those things. It was the expression of a person who has crossed the boundary of what they can control and found past the boundary. Something that does not need to be controlled. It found Malgus completely. The ground of Alderaan rose to meet his face with no space between the decision and the consequence. Then nothing. Then here, the sound, the chamber, the machine breathing where his face used to breathe for itself. Yet he folds the memory away. He will not take it out again today. Malgus had planned his campaigns on Alderaan twice before. He knew the smell of its lowland forests, green and damp, a specific coolness that Dromund Kaas never produced. He knew the quality of its light in early morning, pale and clean, in a way that the eternal storm cover of home made impossible. He had stood on Alderaanian soil and felt, briefly and without indulging it, that he understood why people fought to keep things. That Malgus, the one who stood in Alderaanian morning light and noticed it, felt very far away right now. The respirator did not care about morning light. It breathed. He accompanied it. The second medic was older, unhurried, the kind of man whose work had become meditative rather than stressful over the years. He checked the readings without urgency. He made his notations. He did not adjust his breathing when he found Malgus already watching him. "The integration is holding," he said. Not to Malgus specifically, to the record he was building. "Your tissue is responding within acceptable parameters." "How long before I can stand?" Malgus said. A pause. "You can stand now, my lord. The surgery was to your face. Your legs are..." He was already standing. The world did not tilt. His balance held precisely. He stood the way he had always stood, weight distributed, spine correct. The posture of a man whose skeleton remembers body armor, even when the armor is absent. The older medic looked at him, made no additional recommendations. The viewport was at eye level from standing. Alderaan filled the lower quarter of it, green, patient. The cloud cover moved across its surface at the speed of something that has been doing this for several billion years and sees no reason to change its pace. Malgus stood and looked at the planet. The medic gathered his things and left. He understood correctly that this moment was not his to be present for. The room was empty. The planet turned below. The respirator marked its rhythm in the silence. And then, in the narrow, dark reflection of the viewport, there was a face. Or rather, there was something where a face should be. Sealed. Dark. The faint amber glow of the respirator's status indicators. The silhouette of a man looking at a planet, except the silhouette's face was machinery, and the machinery was what the silhouette used to breathe. Malgus looked at this reflection. He did not recognize it. This was not a dramatic fact. It was a biological one. The mind carries a version of the face it belongs to, built from decades of mirrors and windows and peripheral self-awareness. And that version is specific and detailed and not easily revised. What looked back from the viewport did not match the version. The shapes were different, the proportions were different. The lower half of the face was wrong, in ways the mind registers before it can find language for the wrongness. He kept looking. The respirator breathed. Alderaan turned below, unhurt, indifferent, proceeding according to its own logic. Malgus stood at the viewport and looked at the face in the reflection, until the face in the reflection began to seem less like a wrongness and more like a fact. He looked until the shape stopped being wrong and started being his. He looked until he recognized it. This took some time. Darth Malgus had broken through Jedi lines on 6 worlds before Alderaan. He had studied every major Jedi engagement record available to Imperial intelligence. He had memorized the tactical tendencies of 11 active Jedi Masters. He had built a reputation inside the Imperial war machine as someone who did not fail, not because he was lucky, but because he understood that preparation was the only honest form of confidence. All of that was still true. All of that was still him. The face in the viewport was also him. He decided this standing at the glass, with Alderaan below and the respirator breathing for him, and the medical chamber empty and silent around him. He decided it the way he decided everything, without performance, without ceremony, without requiring that the decision feel like anything in particular. The face was his. The sound was his. He would proceed. What he could not yet decide, what he stood at the viewport not deciding for longer than he would admit to anyone, was something smaller. Not the mask, not the mission, not the war that continued without him, while he recovered in this narrow room on this Imperial command ship above this green and indifferent planet. Something smaller than all of that. A question about the version of himself that breathed without a machine, where that version had gone. Whether the word gone was even the right word. He did not find an answer at the viewport. He looked for one for a long time. The galaxy offered nothing. In, then out. The face in the viewport stayed with him, not the mask. The face behind it, the one that existed before Alderaan, before the surgery, before the machine took over the simple work of breathing. That face had a specific quality he could not fully reconstruct anymore. Not because the memory was gone, because the memory was accurate, and accuracy was the problem. He knew exactly what that face had looked like. He simply could not locate it anymore in the reflection. It had been replaced. Precisely. Permanently. He sat with this fact the way you sit with facts that are true and useless simultaneously. And somewhere in the sitting, Dromund Kaas came back to him. Not the city, not the imperial district with its deliberate architecture and its statements of permanence. Not the citadel or the dark temple, or any of the places that exist to remind you what power looks like from the outside. The smell. Dromund Kaas smells like rain that has been falling for so long it has become part of the air itself. It smells like wet stone and ozone and something underneath both of those. Something older, something the storms produce through sheer repetition, a mineral darkness that settles into the back of the throat and stays. Children who grow up on Dromund Kaas do not notice this smell. It is simply the smell of existence. Veradun noticed it the first time he left. He was 9 years old. A transport, a brief posting his patron was completing on a Republic border world. 3 standard weeks of air that did not have that quality of accumulated rain. When they returned, he stepped off the landing ramp and the smell hit him like recognition, like the galaxy confirming that this was still the place he came from. He had not expected to feel anything about that. He felt something about that. He did not mention it to anyone. His patron's name was Kor, an imperial official of middling rank and precise ambitions, the kind of man who understood that advancement in the Empire required assets, and that assets came in various forms, and that a force-sensitive child with the specific quality of stillness that Veradun possessed was worth considerably more than his current situation suggested. Kor was not cruel. This is worth stating clearly, because the Sith tradition produces cruelty in abundance, and it would be easy to assign it here where it does not belong. Kor was calculating. This is different. He saw what the boy was and made a practical decision. The Sith academies would find Veradun eventually. Force sensitivity at that level does not stay hidden for long, and the Empire's mechanisms for locating and claiming it were thorough. Kor simply found him first and arranged the terms accordingly. A patron's investment, a relationship with stakes on both sides. Veradun entered the Sith tradition not through the brutal selection process of Korriban's slave pits. He entered through a door that was, at its edges, almost civil. Almost. The academy on Dromund Kaas was not Korriban. This distinction mattered. Korriban's academies were ancient and deliberately brutal, places designed to kill the weak and sharpen the surviving remainder into instruments. Dromund Kaas trained differently, more structure, more doctrine. The cruelty was still present, but it was institutional rather than ambient. It served a purpose that someone had at least considered. Veradun arrived at 11 and understood within the first week that he was being watched in a specific way. Not with suspicion, with assessment. He was being measured against a standard that no one stated openly. He measured himself against it anyway, because measuring himself against unstated standards was something he had learned to do before he had language for the skill. He did not know, at 11, what the standard was. By 12, he understood it was not skill. Skill was everywhere in the academy. The students who washed out were not always unskilled. Some of them were technically precise, well-trained, capable of things that would have been extraordinary anywhere else. What they lacked was something harder to name. Veradun had it. He knew he had it, the way you know things about yourself that you didn't decide. It was simply there, a quality of his attention, a particular way of being present in a moment that did not involve performance or urgency. He did not know yet what it was going to cost him. The first time he defeated a senior student, he was 13. The student was 16, larger, faster in the reactive sense. the kind of speed that comes from good instincts and consistent training. He had defeated everyone at his level and most people above it, and he expected Veridun to be another entry in a sequence that had become predictable. The training floor was stone, cold, the kind of surface that transmits sound clearly. Every footfall, every shift of weight, every moment of contact between the practice blades and the air. It lasted 4 minutes. At the end of it, the senior student was on the floor, and Veridun was standing, and the room was very quiet. He stood in the quiet and waited for something to arrive. Pride, maybe. Satisfaction. The specific warmth of having accomplished something difficult. These were things he had watched other students display after victories, and he had filed the displays as data without fully understanding the source material. Nothing arrived. There was clarity. The fight had produced a specific quality of clarity, a sense of all variables resolved, all uncertainties collapsed into a single outcome that was clean and complete and felt, if he was honest, like the best version of thinking he knew how to do. But pride, satisfaction. He looked at the student on the floor. He felt, primarily, that the student should get up. He reached down and helped him. This was noted by the overseeing instructor and filed in a way that Veridun did not have access to and would not understand the significance of for several more years. The second moment came at 14. A new instructor, a different subject, not combat technique, but application. What the academy termed practical instruction, which was a phrase that covered a range of things and was deliberately vague about the range. On this particular afternoon, practical instruction meant a captive, a Republic intelligence operative, someone who had information the Empire wanted and who was, the instructor explained with the calm precision of a man discussing weather systems, going to provide it. The student's task was to assist in the provision. Veridun understood what was being asked. He performed it. What the chapter must be careful to show, what cannot be stated but must be felt, is that Veridun performed it with full awareness that he was performing it. He did not detach. He did not find a way to make the action feel like something other than what it was. He kept his attention clear and present and did what was required of him. And afterward, standing outside the instruction room in the corridor's cold light, he was aware of two things simultaneously. The first, he had done this. The second, he had noticed himself doing this. The gap between those two facts, between the action and the witness of the action, was very small, almost nothing. He understood, standing in the corridor, that the gap was going to keep shrinking. He understood that this was what the academy was for. He did not know, yet, whether he minded. The thunder on Droman Kars is not like thunder elsewhere. It is not a single sound. It is a system. The storms that ring the planet perpetually are deep and ancient, and they produce sound the way organs produce sound. In layers, in harmonics, in sequences that overlap and build and resolve in ways that have no fixed duration. Children on Droman Kars fall asleep to this. Veridun fell asleep to this every night, from the age of 11 onward, and never once, in all those years, stopped hearing it. Other students stopped hearing it within months. It became background. It became silence with texture. It became the condition of the place rather than a feature of it. He kept hearing it. He did not know why. Later, much later, and in medical chambers and command ships and the long silences of the Cold War, he would try to locate the last night he heard the thunder without the machine mediating everything, and he would find that he could not identify the specific night. It had simply, at some point that was not marked and could not be recovered, become the sound of breathing instead. The third moment was different from the first two. He was 15. The academy had servants. This was not unusual. The Empire maintained a category of people who occupied necessary positions without status, and the academy used them for the work that students and instructors did not perform. They moved through the corridors in the specific way of people who have learned to take up as little space as possible. They were present and invisible simultaneously, which is a skill that requires more discipline than most of the academy's students possessed, and which none of the academy's students were trained to notice. Veradun noticed. He had been noticing for months. The specific routes they took, the times of day they appeared, the quality of their silence, how it differed from the silence of deference and the silence of fear and the silence of exhaustion, 3 different silences that wore similar expressions. The Twi'lek woman who brought water to the training corridors came at the same time every afternoon. First dark had not yet ended. The academy was between sessions. The corridor was empty except for Veradun, who was reviewing combat sequences in his head the way he often did between formal sessions, not moving, just seated against the wall, eyes open, running the variables. She walked past without seeing him, stopped, set down the water vessel, straightened, stood completely still for one moment with her eyes closed. Just one moment. Then she picked up the vessel, turned, and saw him. Her expression adjusted immediately, smoothly. The professional recalibration of someone who has learned to be invisible, and briefly, unexpectedly, was not. She crossed to him, offered the water, did not look at his face. He took the water. She left. He sat with the water and thought, for no reason he could name, with no context that explained why this moment and not another, that she was tired, not performing tiredness, not displaying exhaustion as information, simply tired in the way of someone who has been doing something for a long time without a clear end to the doing. He thought about this for the rest of the afternoon. He thought about it in a way that had no strategic value and produced no useful conclusion, and yet would not resolve into something dismissible. He did not think about it in those terms. He was 15. He simply thought about it. At 16, the Dromund Kaas Academy had a courtyard, storm-battered, the stone worn smooth by years of rain and then cracked by the cold that followed certain storm systems. The walls that enclosed it were high enough to break the worst of the wind, but not high enough to block the sky. The sky above Dromund Kaas is always moving. Veradun stood in the courtyard in the early descending, the evening hours between the last formal session and the night period, with his training lightsaber in his hand and the lightning writing itself across the clouds above him. He was not practicing. He was standing. He had been doing this for perhaps 20 minutes when the understanding arrived. Not dramatically. Not with the quality of revelation that the Sith tradition liked to attach to moments of clarity. It arrived the way most true things arrive, quietly, in the middle of something ordinary, with the feeling of something that had been building for a long time finally becoming visible. He was going to be very good at this. He knew this with the same calm certainty that he knew anything, without needing it to be confirmed, without requiring the validation of the academy, or his patron, or any of the instructors who watched him with their filing eyes. He was going to be one of the best, and being one of the best was going to cost him things. He could not yet see what things. He understood that this was the nature of the cost, that it could not be seen from here, only from later, only from the place you arrived at after paying it, without knowing the amount in advance. The lightning moved through the clouds above him. He watched it. He breathed, clean, unmediated, his own breath rising and falling in the cold courtyard air with all its small variations, its unconscious adjustments, its ordinary and unremarkable aliveness. He breathed and watched the lightning and held the understanding in the same way he held everything difficult, without resistance, without the need for it to be something other than what it was. He would pay the cost. He did not yet know what the cost was. He would be standing at a viewport above a green and cloud-covered planet before he understood that some costs are not paid once. Some costs are structural. Some costs are what you are made of, and you do not finish paying them. You simply keep breathing. Or a machine breathes for you. And the difference between those two things is smaller than it sounds, and larger than anything he could see from a storm-battered courtyard at 16, watching lightning that did not need him to understand it. The lightning did not need anything from him. That was the only comfort the sky had ever offered. He looked up at it for a long time. He would not look up again. Not like this. Not with this specific quality of openness. The head tilted back, the throat exposed, the eyes tracking something enormous and indifferent and beautiful in its indifference. The man he was becoming looked forward, only forward, at the level of what could be fought. The boy in the courtyard did not know this yet. He kept looking up. The clouds moved. The lightning continued its ancient work. The thunder arrived in its layered, harmonic way, rolling through the enclosed space of the courtyard and filling it completely. And Veradun breathed, simply, cleanly, without assistance. One last time before everything that came after. She did not enter a room. She arrived in it, already present, already settled, already occupying the precise minimum of space required and no more. If you were not paying attention, you would not notice the transition. One moment, the room had a certain quality. The next moment, it had a different quality. And the difference was her. Malgus noticed. He was not, at this point in his life, a man who missed things. His attention was one of the instruments he kept sharpest. Not because the Sith tradition demanded it, though it did, but because he had understood from early in his training that attention was the foundation everything else was built on. You could be fast, you could be strong, you could have studied every combat record in the Imperial Archive, and none of it mattered if you were not first, completely paying attention. He paid attention. And so, he noticed Elara Daru on the first morning in the household of the Imperial official whose residence he had been assigned during the campaign's logistical pause. He noticed the way she moved through the dining chamber. He noticed which tasks she had been given and which she had assigned herself without being asked. He noticed, and this was the detail that did not resolve cleanly into any useful category, that she watched everything, not with fear, not with the vigilant, exhausted watchfulness of someone monitoring for threats, with interest, as if the world, even this particular corner of it, with its particular cruelties and its particular smallness, was still genuinely interesting to her. He did not know what to do with this observation. He filed it and moved on. On the second day, he watched her more deliberately. Not obviously. He had spent years developing the ability to observe without appearing to observe. It was one of the skills the Academy had formalized, but that he had possessed before the Academy, as a natural consequence of being a child in a household where reading the room correctly was not optional. He watched her work. She was efficient in the way of someone who has performed the same tasks so many times that the performance has become unconscious, leaving the mind free for other things. Her hands knew what they were doing. The rest of her was somewhere else, not absent, not daydreaming in the soft sense, thinking, processing. She's taking in whatever the room was offering and doing something with it that was not visible from the outside. He found himself constructing an explanation for his continued attention. She was a potential security variable, a slave attached to a household he was temporarily occupying. Her loyalties, her information access, her connections to the household's communication channels were legitimate intelligence concerns. The explanation was accurate. It was also, and he was aware of this, not the explanation. He filed this awareness alongside the original observation and continued watching. On the third day, she brought him water, not because he had asked, because it was the third hour of high iron, and he had been seated at the campaign table for 6 consecutive hours, and the water vessel beside him had been empty for 2 of them, and she had noticed. She set it down without announcement, without looking at his face. The same quality of professional invisibility he had observed in the academy corridor years ago. Presence without intrusion, service without performance. She turned to leave. "Wait," he said. She stopped, turned back. Her expression adjusted to neutral, with the practiced ease of someone who had been making this adjustment their entire life. He looked at her for a moment. He had been going to ask her something, a question that was reasonable, contextually appropriate, connected to the security assessment framework he had constructed to explain his attention. He did not ask it. Thank you," he said instead. The adjustment in her expression was very small, almost nothing, but he was paying attention, and what he saw in that almost nothing was something he recognized. The specific quality of a person encountering something unexpected and choosing, in real time, how much of their response to show. She showed very little. "Of course, my lord," she said. She left. He sat with the empty question and the full water vessel, and the fact that he had said something true and useless instead of something strategic and necessary. And he understood that the explanation he had constructed was no longer serviceable. He would need a different explanation. He spent the rest of the afternoon not finding one. He freed her while she was asleep. This was deliberate. Not because he was avoiding the conversation. He was not a man who avoided conversations. But because he understood that the act of freeing someone, witnessed by the person being freed, becomes immediately complicated by gratitude and confusion and the weight of obligation. And he did not want any of those things in the room when he did this. He wanted it clean. He removed her from the household records at the second hour of deep dark, reclassified. New documentation arranged through channels that were available to him and not available to most people, and which left no clear trail connecting the reclassification to him specifically. He told no one. He went back to the campaign table and worked until stormrise. He did not tell her for another 2 weeks. When he did tell her, briefly, factually, in a corridor between one task and the next, she stopped walking and stood very still for a moment, and he watched her process it, watched her find the place in her understanding where this information could be placed and what it meant and what it required of her. Then she said, "Why?" He had prepared for several responses. He had not prepared for that one. "You were an inefficiency," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. "That is not why," she said. She was correct. He did not confirm this. He walked away. But she was correct, and they both knew she was correct. And the knowing was the first shared thing, the first moment that existed between them rather than simply near them, and that distinction was the beginning of everything that followed. The years of campaigns do not resolve into a clean sequence. They exist in the telling, as texture, as the accumulated quality of a long time spent in close proximity to someone who sees you. Not the you of the title and the armor and the deliberate certainty, the other one, the one underneath. Elena traveled with him. This was, officially, a practical arrangement. She handled certain logistical and communication tasks. She was present in contexts where a Twi'lek companion was unremarkable. She occupied a role that was defined in official records with the particular vagueness of things that need documentation, but resist description. Unofficially, she was the only person on any ship or any planet who spoke to him as if his response was genuinely uncertain. Everyone else had already decided what his response would be before they asked the question. Sure, they asked anyway, protocol required it. But the asking was performance. They knew what Darth Malgus would say. They had built their plans around what Darth Malgus would say. Elena asked as if she did not know. Sometimes she was wrong about him. He found this unreasonably valuable. They developed a language, not a code exactly. Nothing so formal. More an economy of reference. Shared observations compressed into shorthand. A particular silence that meant one thing between them and nothing between anyone else. The way she would set something down slightly to his left when she wanted him to look at it without appearing to look at it. The way he would pause one beat longer than necessary at a doorway when he wanted her to follow without being asked directly. None of this was planned. It simply accumulated the way all real languages accumulate, through repetition and correction and the gradual understanding of what works. He was aware, during this period, of what it meant that this language existed. He was aware that it was a vulnerability. He filed this awareness alongside all the other things he had filed without acting on, in the place where he kept the things that were true and which he had not yet decided what to do with. The place was getting full. The night on Alderaan was not planned either. It was the evening before a campaign briefing that would consume the following 3 days. The logistics of the assault had been reviewed and confirmed. The variables had been accounted for. There was nothing productive left to do before Stormrise and the formal beginning of whatever came next. They sat outside. This alone was unusual. Dromund Kaas did not produce outside in any comfortable sense. The storms made exterior space a thing you moved through rather than occupied. Most Imperial postings were similarly enclosed. But Alderaan was different. Alderaan was one of those planets that seemed, to people from harsher worlds, almost aggressively hospitable. The air clean and soft, the evenings cool without cruelty, the sky doing something that skies on other planets simply did not do. It was full of stars, not obscured by cloud cover, not hazed by city light, simply stars. More than you expected, more than felt reasonable. They sat on a low ridge above the encampment, not touching, not speaking, and the stars were enormous above them. Elena named 3 of them. She did it without preamble, just pointed and said a name, and pointed again, and said another. The names were not imperial designations. They were something older, softer, in a register that he associated with her specifically, and not with any formal language he could identify. He listened to all 3 names. Then, how do you know those? She was quiet for a moment. My mother taught me, she said. He looked at the 3 stars she had named. Her mother had named them for her. Her mother was... He did not know the details, and this was a particular kind of not knowing. The kind where you have not asked because asking would make the not knowing permanent in a different way. Whatever had happened to her mother had happened before Elena became the person sitting on this ridge above this encampment under these stars. He looked at the stars. She looked at the stars. Neither of them said anything for a long time. So this was not uncomfortable silence. It was the other kind, the kind that has weight and texture and warmth, the kind that two people can only inhabit together if they have accumulated enough shared language to make the silence legible. They had accumulated enough. He sat in it and breathed the clean Alderaanian air and felt, at the edges of something he did not examine directly, that this specific configuration of time and place and person was the kind of thing people meant when they used words he had always found strategically imprecise. He did not use those words, but he felt their edges. And then the night ended, and the campaign began, and the battle came, and the ground of Alderaan rose to meet his face, and the medical chamber and the machine. He was lying in the medical chamber, the second day, the suppressants beginning to thin, the first edges of real sensation returning to his face in ways the medic had warned him about, and which were exactly as described. When he understood something about Elena that he had not previously organized into language, she was the reason he could not stop. Not the war, not the empire, not the emperor's vision or his own ideology, or the accumulated momentum of a career that had made certain continuations inevitable. Her. Specifically, the fact that she was still alive, and that she was on this ship, and that when he recovered enough to walk through that door, she would be on the other side of it, and she would look at him, at the mask, at the new face, at the thing that had replaced the old thing, and she would not adjust her expression the way the medic had adjusted. She would simply look, as if his response was genuinely uncertain, as if she did not already know what he was going to be. He lay in the medical chamber, and the respirator breathed for him, and the suppressants continued their thinning, and the pain arrived in increments, and underneath all of it, underneath the machinery and the facts and the cold precision of his assessment of his current situation, he held this understanding. She was the reason. He had not decided yet what to do with that. He had not decided yet whether it was a reason to continue or a reason to be afraid. It was both. He had always known it was both. The 3 stars she had named were still up there, above Alderaan's cloud cover, above the campaign that had broken his face, above everything. Named by a mother he would never know, given to Elena, given by Elena to him. She on a ridge above an encampment on a night that was finished now and could not be returned to. He held them anyway, in the place where he kept things that were true. Korriban does not welcome you. This is not metaphor. The planet has a quality, atmospheric, geological, something older than either, that registers in the body before the mind names it. A pressure, not physical exactly, though the air is thin and dry and carries a heat that feels personal rather than climatic. Something underneath the heat. Something the ancient Sith built into this place through sheer accumulated intention over thousands of years of burial and ritual, and the specific violence of people who believed that power left traces in stone. It does leave traces. Malgus felt them the moment the landing ramp descended. He did not find this unsettling. He found it clarifying, the way certain kinds of pressure clarify, stripping away the unnecessary and leaving only what is structural. Korriban was not a comfortable planet. It was an honest one. It did not pretend that what happened here was anything other than what it was. He respected this. Darth Vindican descended the ramp ahead of him. This was protocol. The master preceded the apprentice, in all things, in all contexts, without exception. Malgus followed at the correct distance and observed, as he had been observing for 3 years, the quality of his master's movement. It was fine. That was the problem. It was fine in the way that things are fine when something essential has been subtracted and the remaining structure is still functional and will remain functional for some time before the subtraction becomes visible to anyone who is not paying very close attention. Malgus was paying very close attention. Vindican had been a significant Sith Lord once. The records, which Malgus had studied thoroughly before his assignment, because he studied everything thoroughly before any assignment, indicated a career of genuine distinction. Campaigns that demonstrated not just power, but judgment. Decisions made under pressure that had the specific quality of decisions made by someone who understood the difference between what was strategically correct and what was emotionally satisfying, and who consistently chose correctly. That Vindican had been formidable. The Vindican standing on Korriban's landing surface, surveying the ancient terrain with the particular stillness of a man performing survey rather than actually conducting it, was something adjacent to formidable. Adjacent. Malgus had identified the change approximately 8 months into his apprenticeship and had spent the following 2.5 years refining his assessment without acting on it. The change was not dramatic. It was the kind of change that happens to people over long periods of sustained pressure. Not a breaking, but a settling. A gradual compression of the range within which a person operates. Vindican had become, incrementally, a man who moved within a smaller set of possibilities than he had once occupied. His speed was the most visible symptom. Not physical speed, that remained adequate. The speed of his assessment. The interval between perception and decision had lengthened in ways that were individually unmeasurable, but cumulatively significant. He was still fast by any reasonable standard. He was no longer fast by the standard that this operation required. Malgus had not yet decided what to do with this assessment. He was still deciding when the Jedi arrived. Chen Darash was old. Not frail. There is a category of old that moves through the world with an accumulated solidity that youth cannot replicate, and the Jedi Master occupied this category fully. He moved like someone who had resolved, long ago, every question about what he was and what he was for, and now simply expressed the resolution through action, without the friction of ongoing doubt. Malgus recognized this quality. He had it himself, or had been building it. He recognized it the way you recognize a version of something you are in the process of constructing, with the specific attention of a craftsman examining another craftsman's finished work. The young one, Sateli Shan, was different. He had seen her file. He had assessed her as a capable but unfinished combatant, strong in force sensitivity, still developing the judgment that would eventually organize her power into something more than raw capability. This assessment had been accurate as far as it went. It had not gone far enough. He understood this within 30 seconds of the engagement beginning. The battle was not what the briefing had described. Briefings rarely are. This is not a failure of intelligence, exactly, but a structural limitation. Intelligence captures what has happened and projects from patterns. It cannot capture what a person will do in a specific moment under specific pressure when certain variables align in a sequence that has never aligned before. Chen Daru fought with the completeness of a man who had nothing to prove and had therefore stopped reserving anything. This was difficult to fight. Malgus managed it. He was managing it, the engagement complex, but not beyond him. The variables significant, but within the range of what his training and instinct could process. When he became aware, through the peripheral attention he maintained even in the middle of combat, that Vindican was struggling. Not losing. Not yet. Struggling in the specific way that confirmed everything Malgus had been observing for 3 years. The intervals. The compressed range. The decisions arriving fractionally late and then compensated for with power rather than judgment, which works until it doesn't. Which works until you are fighting a Jedi Master who has also identified the interval and has begun to operate inside it. Darak found the interval. Vindican took the wound. Malgus killed Darak. This is stated plainly because the killing itself was not the significant event. The significant event was what Malgus observed in the 12 seconds between Vindican taking the wound and Malgus completing the engagement with Darak. In those 12 seconds, Vindican's force presence changed, not diminished. The wound was serious but not immediately critical. Changed in a more fundamental way. The quality of certainty that had defined Vindican's presence, even in its reduced form, even after 3 years of the settling and compression Malgus had been tracking, that quality flickered. Just once. Just for a moment. But Malgus felt it. And feeling it, he understood something that the assessment he had been building for 3 years had been approaching, but had not yet reached. It was not that Vindican was slower. It was not that his range had compressed. It was that the certainty, The specific, structural confidence of a Sith Lord who knows what he is had developed a fracture. Small, possibly recoverable, but present. A Sith Lord with a fracture in his certainty was something the tradition had a clear position on. Malgus knew the position. He had always known the position. He had simply not yet been in a situation where the position applied. Satele Shan escaped. He let her go. This is the detail, the historical record notes without analysis. The young Jedi Padawan survived the encounter at Korriban, while her master did not. And Darth Malgus, who had every tactical reason to pursue, did not pursue. The record does not explain this. Malgus did not explain it either, then or afterward. What the record cannot access is the specific quality of his attention in the moment he watched her go, the assessment he ran, the conclusion he reached, the decision that was not quite a decision because it did not feel like a choice so much as a recognition. She would be a problem later. He was certain of this. He let her go anyway. He has asked himself why, in the years since, and the answer he returns to is this. He was not finished with Vindican yet, and he could not attend to two things simultaneously, and Vindican was the more immediate requirement. This is true. It is also, he is aware, not the complete answer. The complete answer involves the 3 stars above Alderaan and a woman on a ship above Korriban, and a part of him that was not yet, not quite yet, finished with the idea that some things could be let go. He filed this awareness. He turned back to Vindican. His master was kneeling. The wound had taken something structural from him, not just tissue, not just the specific physical capacity of the affected area. Something deeper. Vindican knelt on Korriban's ancient surface with the quality of a man who has reached the end of the argument he has been making with himself for a long time. And the argument has resolved, and the resolution is not what he hoped. He looked up at Malgus. Malgus looked at him. There was no performance in this exchange, no theatre. The tradition had theatre built into it. There were ways this moment was supposed to look, ways it was supposed to feel, the vocabulary of Sith mastery and succession that had been constructed over centuries to give this particular kind of act a shape that made it legible. None of that was present. It was simply 2 people who had spent 3 years in close proximity looking at each other with complete clarity. "You have seen this coming," Vindican said. Not a question. "Yes," Malgus said. Vindican nodded once, the nod of a man confirming something he already knew. The lightsaber made a sound when it moved. Then the sound stopped. Then there was silence, the specific silence of Korriban, which is not empty silence, but filled silence, weighted with whatever the planet has accumulated over millennia of exactly this kind of moment. Malgus stood over his master for one full breath, one mechanical, precise, identical breath. And then he waited for something to arrive. Guilt, maybe. The specific grief of having ended something that was also, in its way, the structure he had been operating within for 3 years. Or triumph. The Sith tradition promised triumph at this moment. The surge of power that the text described as the apprentice's completion. Neither arrived. What arrived was verification. He had confirmed something about himself he had already known. Not that he was capable of this. He had known he was capable of this since the academy corridor, since the instruction room, since all the small moments of the performance he had been giving and noticing himself give. He had known. What he had not known, what required this specific moment to confirm, was how it would feel to know it without the performance. It felt like nothing. It felt like the clearing of a variable that had been pending for too long. It felt, if he was honest, like accuracy. He stood on Korriban's surface afterward. The heat rose from the stone in the particular way of ancient places, not ambient heat, not the product of a sun's angle or atmospheric conditions, but heat that seemed to come from inside the planet itself, from below, from whatever the Sith had put here over thousands of years of deliberate accumulation. He stood in it and did not move. The operation was complete. The tomb had been secured. The reports would need to be filed. The ship above was waiting. Alina was on the ship above. He thought of her. The thought arrived without strategy, without context, without the framework of assessment and implication that he applied to most things. It arrived the way the smell of Drom and Kars had arrived when he returned from his first off-world posting as a child, as simple recognition, as the mind confirming the location of something it had been tracking without announcing the tracking. She was there, above this planet, above this heat and this ancient stone and this silence where his master had been. The thought was strange. It was soft in a way that felt wrong against the verification he had just performed, like a crack in something he had just confirmed was solid. He stood with the strangeness of it, the specific dissonance of a man who has just completed an act of cold precision, discovering that somewhere in him there is still a register that operates on different terms entirely. He did not know what to do with the strangeness. He stood in the heat of Korriban and breathed, his own breath, still, unmediated, the machine not yet necessary, and thought of Alina on the ship above. And the heat rose, and the silence held, and Korriban did not care about any of it, which was, he supposed, the one thing ancient places and cold precision had in common. Neither of them needed you to feel something. They simply waited. The 14th of Korriban's reach, year 1328 of the Imperial Reckoning. Coruscant from above looks like something that has forgotten it was ever anything else. No land visible. No water. Just the city, endless, geometric, layered over itself so many times that the original surface of the planet exists now only as a concept, as a theoretical bottom to something that stopped having a bottom centuries ago. From the upper atmosphere, in the grey pre-assault light, it looks less like a planet than like an argument, a civilization's extended insistence that space can be filled, that every available surface can be claimed, that the act of building is the act of meaning. Malgus stood at the forward viewport of the troop carrier and looked at it. Around him, soldiers prepared. He was aware of them the way he was aware of weather, present, relevant, not requiring his direct attention. The sounds they made were specific to this particular kind of moment. Equipment checked and rechecked, not because it needed checking, but because the hands needed something to do, while the mind processed the scale of what was coming. Buckles, refastened. Power cells, verified. The same sequence repeated with the focused attention of people who understand that what they are about to do cannot be undone, and who have organized this understanding into motion, because motion is more manageable than stillness. Malgus was still. He had been still for the entire descent. He was thinking about the temple. Not tactically. The tactical assessment was complete, had been complete for weeks, every variable accounted for, every contingency mapped against available responses. He was thinking about it the way you think about a place you have studied for a long time before visiting. The gap between the maps and the actual space. The thing that documentation cannot capture, that you will only understand when you are standing inside it. The temple had been there for 4,000 years. He was going to walk through its doors in approximately 40 minutes. He stood at the viewport and looked at Coruscant below and breathed his own breath. Still his own, still unmediated, the machine not yet part of him, and felt the specific quality of a moment before something permanent. Coruscant's upper levels were quiet at this hour. The assault had been timed with precision, the moment in the day's cycle when the temple's public areas were between functions, when the flow of Jedi and visitors and support staff was at its lowest ebb. Not because Malgus needed the reduced numbers, because he wanted as few variables as possible between the carrier's landing ramp and the temple's great hall. He wanted to reach Ven Zalo without interruption. He had studied Zalo the way he studied all significant opponents, thoroughly, without assumption, with the specific attention of someone who knows that what you expect is the first thing an honest fight will remove. The record described a Jedi Knight of considerable ability, calm under pressure, tactically flexible, the particular kind of dangerous that does not announce itself. What the record could not tell him, what no record ever tells you, was the quality of Zalo's presence. Whether he was the kind of person who fights from fear of losing, or the kind who fights from something quieter and more fundamental, he would know when he saw him. The temple smelled like time. This was the first thing. Before the architecture, before the scale of the interior, before any of the tactical variables he had mapped from intelligence reports. The smell. Incense, yes, and old stone, and the particular quality of a space that has been inhabited continuously for millennia by people who practice stillness as discipline. But underneath those things, something else. Something that had no precise name in any language he knew. The Force. Not as a concept, as a sensory fact. Concentrated here, the way water concentrates in a depression, the way heat accumulates in enclosed stone. 4,000 years of Jedi presence had left something in the walls, in the floors, in the air itself. A resonance, a weight, the accumulated trace of 10,000 lives lived in deliberate service to something larger than personal power. He walked through it. His soldiers moved on his flanks. Explosions in the outer corridors, the sounds of engagement elsewhere in the structure, other squads executing other objectives, the assault proceeding according to its design. He registered all of this peripherally and continued walking toward the Great Hall. The temple resisted him, not physically, not through its defenders, though they came, Jedi and guards and support staff who had training and courage, and who were, most of them, not enough. The resistance was something else, something in the quality of the space itself, pushing back against his presence the way a body pushes back against something foreign. He was wrong here. The Force knew it. He could feel it knowing. He continued anyway. This was, he understood, the point. The Great Hall opened before him. He stopped. Not because anything required him to stop. Because the space required acknowledgement. Not reverence. Not the Jedi's specific relationship with this place, but the honest recognition of something that had existed for a very long time and was, in the next few minutes, going to stop existing in the form it had held. The hall was enormous. Columns of pale stone reaching to a ceiling that was also somehow sky. The light entering from above at angles that had been calculated by architects 4,000 years ago to land on specific surfaces at specific times of day, producing an effect that was simultaneously aesthetic and functional. The Jedi used light deliberately, he had read, as part of the environment of attention they tried to cultivate. The light was doing what it had been designed to do. It was still doing this when Ven Zalo walked into it from the far end of the hall. 7 seconds. The distance between them was significant. The hall was large, and they were at opposite ends of it. But the Force does not require proximity for recognition, and what happened in those 7 seconds was not tactical assessment. It was recognition. Zalo looked at him across the length of the Great Hall, and Malgus looked at Zalo, and something passed between them that had no name in military doctrine, or Sith teaching, or any of the frameworks Malgus had used to organize his understanding of combat. Zalo was not afraid. This was not the absence of fear that comes from training, or discipline, or the performance of readiness. This was something more complete. A man who had, at some point prior to this moment, finished the argument with himself about what he was willing to pay, and had paid it in advance, and was now simply present in the hall with the specific freedom of someone who has nothing left to withhold. He fought without reservation. This was not a common thing. Malgus had fought skilled opponents. He had fought fearless opponents. He had fought opponents who were technically superior in specific areas and who used those advantages with precision. He had not, until this moment, fought someone who was doing the truest thing they knew how to do and was doing it completely. The fight was fast. It was also, and this is the detail that resisted being filed, that kept returning to him in the years after, that would not stay in any category he tried to assign it. It was also the most honest conversation he had ever had. Not in words, in the exchange itself, in the specific quality of what Zalo brought to it, and what Malgus brought to it, and what the meeting of those two things produced. Zalo died. He died without performance, without the dramatic culmination that the Sith tradition built into its mythology of these moments. He simply, at a certain point in the exchange, reached the end of what his body could do, and his body stopped, and he was gone. Malgus stood in the space where Zalo had been. He waited for something. Nothing came. The temple burned. He walked through this as he had walked through the assault, present, functional, attending to what required attention. The fires moved through the older sections with the particular appetite of flames meeting materials that had been dry for centuries. The smell changed, the incense and old stone replaced by something harsher, the specific smell of things that were not designed to burn. Burning. He did not hurry. Outside, in the smoke-filtered light of Coruscant's permanent artificial day, 3 commanders found him at intervals. The first was a senior officer whose campaigns Malgus had respected. He approached with the tihar in a sealed vessel, dark glass, the spirit inside catching the light dully, and offered it with both hands and no words, in the traditional form. Malgus looked at the vessel. He set it aside. The commander withdrew. The second was younger. He had fought well today. Malgus had seen him in the outer corridors, had noted the quality of his decisions under pressure, with the peripheral attention he maintained even in the middle of his own engagement. He offered the tihar with the slightly less practiced form of someone who has learned the tradition, but does not yet inhabit it naturally. Malgus looked at the vessel. He set it aside. The third commander said nothing at all. He simply appeared at Malgus's left, set the vessel down on the stone beside him, and stepped back and waited. Malgus looked at the vessel for longer this time. Then he set it aside. The city stretched in every direction. He stood outside the burning temple on the upper platform that the assault teams had secured, and Coruscant went on and on in all directions to the horizon and past the horizon, building over building over building, the civilization's extended argument, with empty space continuing without interruption as far as he could see. The temple burned behind him. He had planned this operation for months. He had revised every variable. He had built the tactical framework with the patient precision of someone who understands that significant things deserve significant preparation. He had walked through the doors and crossed the great hall and done what he came to do. It was done. He stood in the smoke and looked at the city. He had expected. He understood this now. Standing here in the aftermath of the thing that could not be undone, he had expected something to arrive. Not triumph exactly, not the theatrical surge of Sith mythology. Something more fundamental. The specific sensation of a thing completed. The feeling of arrival. The feeling of a man who has worked towards something for years, finally standing inside it. What arrived was different. What arrived was the hall, the light in it, the smell of it before the fires, Zalo at the far end, the 7 seconds. The quality of what had been exchanged in a fight that was also the most honest conversation he had ever had, with a man who was now gone, with a man he had made gone, and who he understood, standing here in the smoke with the Tahar refused 3 times behind him. He would not find again, not in this army, not in this war, not on any planet the Empire would take in the years that followed. Zalo had been singular. The hall had held something that 4,000 years of deliberate intention had produced. And it was burning now, and what replaced it would be imperial and efficient and deliberately constructed, and would not have that quality of accumulated resonance, would not smell like time, would not produce, in anyone who walked through it, the specific sensation of standing inside something that has believed in itself for longer than any living person can fully comprehend. He had done this. It had been the correct strategic decision. It was also the most significant thing he would ever do, and he was standing in its immediate aftermath, and it was smaller than the working toward it. Not smaller than the meaning, not smaller than the history, smaller than the thing inside him that had been oriented toward it for years. The part that had used this as direction, as north, as the answer to the question of what all of it was for. He was here. He had arrived. And the answer to the question of what all of it was for was Coruscant in every direction, and smoke behind him, and 3 refused glasses of tihar, and a silence where Venzalo used to be. He stood in it. The city did not care. The fires continued their work. And Malgus looked at the endless geometric horizon of the Republic's heart, and breathed his own breath, and understood, with the same cold precision he applied to everything, that something had closed in him today that was not the temple. Something quieter, something that would not be visible for years, something that had no name yet. He would spend the rest of his life not naming it. He heard about the treaty in a corridor, not in a briefing chamber, not in the formal military council where decisions of this scale were supposed to land. A corridor, grey durasteel walls, the specific lighting of functional imperial architecture that exists to illuminate without offering anything beyond illumination, and an aide moving quickly in the opposite direction, who slowed when he saw Malgus and stopped and delivered the information with the careful neutrality of someone who had been briefed on how to say this particular thing to this particular person. The Treaty of Coruscant had been signed. The war was over. Malgus stood in the corridor and received this. The aide waited for a response with the specific stillness of someone who is not sure what form the response will take and wants to be prepared for the range. "Thank you," Malgus said. The aide left. Malgus stood in the corridor for a moment longer. The lighting did what it was designed to do. The walls offered nothing. Somewhere at the other end of the passage, A door opened and closed, and the sound of it carried in the specific way of enclosed spaces, bouncing once off the far wall before it disappeared. He walked to his next scheduled appointment. He was 3 minutes early. The political logic was not difficult to follow. A man who had burned the Jedi Temple was not an asset at a peace negotiation. He was a complication, a reminder of things both sides had agreed, for the purposes of the agreement, to treat as concluded. His presence at the ceremony would have introduced a variable that the diplomats had carefully excluded from the environment they were constructing, an environment premised on the idea that what had happened could be set aside, that the future was a different room from the past, that you could walk from one into the other and close the door. Malgus understood this. He understood it the way he understood most things, completely, without requiring it to feel like anything in particular, filing the logic in the place where logic belonged and continuing. What he did not understand, what would not file cleanly, what kept returning to the surface of his attention in the days following the corridor, was something smaller than the political logic. He had not been told directly. He had heard it secondhand, in a corridor, from an aide who had been briefed on the delivery. Someone had made a decision about how he would receive this information. Someone had calculated the appropriate channel. Someone had determined that Darth Malgus, the man who had walked through the temple's great hall, who had crossed the smoke and the stone and the 4,000 years of accumulated resonance and had set all of it burning, did not need to hear the conclusion of the war he had opened from anyone. Who mattered? He sat with this for 3 days. Then he went to Drummond Cass. He went alone. No escort, no aid, no official itinerary registered in the Imperial movement system. He took a personal transport and landed in the lower district in the deep dark, when the storms were at their loudest and the streets were empty of everything except rain. Drummond Cass in a storm is not a hostile environment. It is simply an honest one. The rain does not care who you are. The thunder does not modulate itself based on your rank or your history or what you did or did not do at Coruscant. It simply continues, the system continuing, the planet proceeding according to its own ancient logic, indifferent in the way that only very old things can be indifferent. He walked through it without a hood. The rain hit the respirator and ran off in the specific way of water finding the path of least resistance. His armor took it without complaint. His boots on the wet stone made a sound that was swallowed immediately by the thunder. He walked for approximately 20 minutes through streets that had nothing to say to him. Then he stopped at a building in the lower district, a structure of no particular distinction, old enough that the original function was no longer clear from the exterior, currently classified in Imperial records as a storage facility attached to a logistics operation that had relocated 3 years ago. The door opened on a code he had set himself. He went inside. He went up 2 levels. He went through another door. He sat down. The room had nothing in it. This is stated plainly, because the plainness is the point. Not nothing in the sense of a space that has been cleared, in the sense of a space that was never filled. The walls were original durasteel, unpainted, the surface showing the specific patina of decades of temperature cycling. The floor was the same. There was one window, narrow, facing the interior of the building rather than the street, which meant it offered a view of another grey wall and nothing else. No furniture except what he had brought once and still used. A single low support, functional, the kind of thing you could find in any supply depot in the Empire. He sat on it. The respirator breathed. The rain hit the exterior walls, and the thunder moved through the building in waves, each one slightly different from the last, the system producing its variations within its overall constancy. He did not know why he had chosen this room. He had asked himself this question several times across the months he had been returning to it, and had not found an answer that satisfied him. The location was not significant. No battle had been fought here, no decision made, no person important to him had ever set foot in it. The room itself had no quality that distinguished it from any of several hundred similar spaces in this district. He had simply found it during a night walk in the period after the temple, when the hollowness had been new and strange and he had been learning its dimensions, and he had gone inside, and he had sat down, and something about the combination of the room's emptiness and the storm's constancy had been not comforting, exactly, accurate. The room was what it was. The storm was what it was. Nothing in either of them required him to be anything other than what he was. He kept coming back. He removed the mask once. This is the detail that cannot be made larger than it is. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. He reached up with both hands, the specific sequence of releases he had learned from the medic, practiced enough times now that the muscle memory was complete, and the seal broke and the mask came away, and he held it in his lap. The air in the room touched his face. His breath, unmediated, rose and fell in the cold and the dark. Raw, irregular in the way of living things, with its small variations, its unconscious adjustments, its ordinary and unremarkable aliveness. He breathed. The thunder moved through the building. Then he replaced the mask, and the seal closed, and the respirator resumed, and the room was as it had been. He sat for a while longer. Then he sat for a while longer still. Alina was on Drummond Cast during this period. She had a residence, small in a district several levels above the lower quarter, the kind of space that official records described with the vague language reserved for arrangements that exist but are not meant to be examined. She had, over the years of campaigns, developed a life that was genuinely hers, within the considerable constraints of what her life could be. She had opinions about the architecture of the upper districts. She had developed a preference for a specific tea that was imported from a mid-rim world at considerable inconvenience. She had, and this was the thing that struck him most consistently, that he could not resolve into any strategic framework. She had continued to be curious. About things, about the world, about the people moving through it, and the reasons they were where they were, and what those reasons said about what people were made of. She had not stopped being interested in things. He found this. He did not have the right word for what he found it. He went to her in the evenings sometimes, after the room, after the storm, after whatever the day had required of Darth Malgus. He went as Veridun, or as close to Veridun as anything could come now. She did not require him to be Darth Malgus in her residence. She did not require him to perform certainty, or project authority, or maintain the posture of a man who has never once questioned the direction of his own momentum. She asked him things. He answered. Sometimes the answers surprised him. He would be partway through a sentence and find himself saying something true that he had not planned to say, something that had been in the filing place for months or years, and she would hear it without making it larger than it was, without treating the accidental honesty as something that needed to be managed. She simply heard it. He was aware, during this period, that this was the most dangerous thing in his life. Not his enemies, not the political complications of the Cold War, not the Emperor's opacity, or the Sith hierarchy's internal competitions, or any of the visible threats that his position generated. Her. Specifically, the fact that she could reach him, that there was a version of him that was reachable, that came to her residence in the evenings and answered questions honestly, and said things he had not planned to say. That version had no armor. That version had left the mask, not literally. The mask was always present, the machine always running. But the other mask, the one made of certainty, the one that functioned as the frame everything else was built on, that version had left it at the door, and the door was not locked. And enemies, the kind who understood what they were looking for, who had the patience to identify a Sith Lord's actual vulnerability rather than his apparent ones, enemies of that quality would find the door eventually. He knew this. He sat in the room with the rain and the thunder and the empty walls, and he knew this with the same cold precision that he knew everything, and he filed it in the place where it belonged, and he did not act on it yet. Not yet. On the night he came back to the room, for what he did not know would be the last time for a long while, the storm was different. Not worse, not louder, just different in the way that storms are sometimes different, a change in the pressure system, a shift in the way the lightning was organized, something in the upper atmosphere altering the quality of the sound that reached the lower districts. He sat and listened to it for a long time. He thought about the treaty, about the corridor, about the aid's careful neutrality, and the decision someone had made about the appropriate channel. He thought about Ven Zalo and the Great Hall and the 7 seconds, and the quality of what had been exchanged in a fight that was also the most honest conversation he had ever had. He thought about Alina naming stars. He sat with all of it, not organizing it, not filing it, just holding it the way you hold things in rooms, with nothing in them. When the storm is outside and the walls are what they are, and there is no one present who requires you to be anything in particular. Then he said something. It was quiet. Almost nothing, in the scale of the things that happen in wars and temples and corridors where treaties are delivered secondhand. It was the kind of sentence that no record would ever find. Too small for documentation, too private for witness, too honest for any context where Darth Malgus existed. He said, "I don't know what any of it was for." Not with grief, not with the dramatic weight of a man in crisis. Simply, factually, quietly, in the dark room with the storm outside, and the respirator breathing its regular rhythm, as if he were completing an assessment he had been running for a very long time. The room did not answer. The thunder moved through the walls. The machine breathed. He sat for another moment. Then he stood and straightened and walked back through the door and down the 2 levels and out into the rain, and became again what the Empire needed him to be. The room stayed empty behind him. It would wait. Empty rooms are patient in ways that people are not. The meeting was held in the upper citadel. Drummond casts outside the windows, the storms doing what they always did. Present, constant, the thunder arriving in its layered way through walls that were designed to muffle it and succeeded only partially. The chamber was long. Dark wood and dark stone, and the specific lighting of imperial formal spaces, which illuminates faces and leaves everything else in a considered shadow. 7 Darths. 11 military commanders. The kind of room where decisions that affect millions of people are made by people who have stopped thinking about millions of people and think instead in terms of variables and outcomes and the management of strategic momentum. Malgus had been in rooms like this many times. He had never said, in a room like this, what he was about to say. He waited until the primary briefing was complete. The briefing concerned the Cold War's current management, the treaty's implementation, the disputed territories, the careful maintenance of an equilibrium that both sides understood was temporary, and neither side would admit was temporary. It was a thorough briefing. Competent. The kind of analysis produced by people who are very good at describing the shape of a problem, without asking whether the problem should exist. When it concluded, there was the standard interval, the pause that formal imperial meetings build in, the moment where responses are invited through the structure of the silence rather than through explicit solicitation. Malgus spoke into it. He presented the case for immediate resumption of hostilities, with the precision he applied to everything. Not aggressively, he was not performing aggression, he was not making a political gesture, he was not positioning himself within the room's hierarchy of competing ambitions. He was making an argument he believed to be correct, and stating it with the completeness it deserved. The treaty was a mistake. Not morally. He did not use moral language, had never found it useful in rooms like this. Strategically, the Empire's internal cohesion was designed for war. The Sith tradition was designed for war. The structures that held the Empire together, the hierarchies, the competitions, the careful management of power through conflict, required an external enemy to remain coherent. Without one, the compression turned inward. The Empire would begin, slowly and then less slowly, to consume itself. He had watched this beginning already. He named specific examples. He cited specific patterns. He presented the argument the way he had constructed it over months of the Cold War's managed stillness, completely, without remainder, without the softening that political calculation imposes on honest assessments. He finished. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet, and what followed was the specific kind of disagreement that happens in rooms where everyone present is accustomed to being the person whose assessment determines outcomes. Several Darths spoke. Several commanders offered the strategic counter-arguments, the Republic's current military posture, the logistical requirements of sustained engagement. The Emperors expressed preference for the current period of consolidation. The Emperors expressed preference. This was the argument that ended the argument. Malgus listened to it. He did not respond to it. The meeting continued. Other matters. Other variables. The room moved on with the momentum of rooms that have resolved their central tension and returned to their regular operations. At the end of the meeting, when the chamber was emptying and conversations were fragmenting into the smaller negotiations that always followed formal sessions, Malgus remained seated for a moment. His hands were flat on the table. He looked at them. Gloved. Still, completely motionless on the dark surface of the table, with the specific quality of stillness that is not the absence of movement, but the active decision to remain in one place while something resolves elsewhere. Something had resolved. The Emperor's vision and his own vision were not the same vision. He had known this for some time. He had filed the knowledge in the place where he kept things that were true and which he had not yet decided what to do with. He had continued to operate within the Emperor's framework, because operating within frameworks is what you do until you understand clearly what operating outside them would require. He understood now. He did not act on this yet. But the decision was made. He stood and straightened and walked out of the chamber into the storm-dark corridors of the citadel, and the meeting behind him closed like water over a stone. The outer territory was called Zeost's Margin in Imperial navigation charts. A disputed system, 3 habitable worlds of minor strategic value, contested not because either the Empire or the Republic particularly wanted them, but because neither was willing to be the first to stop contesting them. The mission was classified as a pacification operation, which was the language the Empire used for the category of action that involved neutralizing a military presence without triggering the treaty's formal escalation protocols. The Cathar commander was named in the intelligence file as Ro Serath. Malgus read the file the way he read all files, completely, with the specific attention of someone who knows that what the file emphasizes is often less important than what it mentions once and moves past. The file emphasized Serath's force strength, his defensive positioning, the military assets of the small independent system he served. It mentioned once, in a subordinate clause, that his troops had not lost a commander in 11 engagements. Malgus read this and paused. 11 engagements. A small force, a disputed territory that neither major power valued enough to commit significant resources to. And 11 engagements without losing a commander, which means either the commanders were retreating before the engagements became critical, or they were fighting with the kind of discipline that keeps people alive not through luck, but through the quality of the decisions being made above them. He went to Zeost's Margin with this detail filed at the front of his attention. Serath fought the way the detail had suggested he would fight. Not with power. His force was smaller than Malgus's, his equipment adequate rather than superior, his tactical position defensible but not dominant. He fought with the kind of honest competence that does not try to be more than it is, and, in not trying, frequently achieves more than it should. He held his position for 6 hours. 6 hours against a force that should have resolved the engagement in 2. Because every decision he made was correct. Not inspired, correct. The difference between a commander who makes inspired decisions and one who makes correct decisions is the difference between someone performing competence and someone who actually possesses it. Malgus spent the 6 hours in a state of attention that he recognized and could not fully explain. He was winning. The engagement was proceeding toward its designed outcome. The variables were being managed. He was also watching Serath's decisions with something that was not tactical assessment, something more like recognition. The engagement concluded. Serath's position was overwhelmed. His remaining forces surrendered with the specific orderly quality of troops who have been led well enough that they maintain discipline even in defeat, which is, Malgus had always believed, the truest measure of a commander. Serath himself was wounded, not critically, present and conscious, and looking at Malgus across the distance of a just concluded engagement with the expression of a man who has done everything he could do and knows it. Malgus looked at him for a moment. Then he gave 3 orders. The first was logged. The second was logged. The third, the one concerning Serath specifically, the reclassification of his status, the arrangement of a transport to neutral space under documentation that would not survive examination, but would not require examination, because no one with authority to examine it had any reason to look, was not logged. No official record connected Malgus to Serath's survival. No official record explained why a defeated commander was released rather than processed. Malgus never explained it. The chapter does not explain it either. He left Zeost's Margin with his mission complete, and something unresolved sitting in his attention. Not guilt, not satisfaction. Something without a name that had to do with 11 engagements and a subordinate clause, and a man who fought without performing it. He filed it alongside the other things that had no category. The place was very full now. The logic was correct. He had constructed it over months, not because he needed months to build it. The essential structure was visible from the beginning. but because some part of him kept returning to it, hoping to find a flaw. A gap. A place where the reasoning broke down and produced a different conclusion. He did not find one. The exposure was real. The number of people who knew about Alina, who had seen her at his side, who had filed the observations in their own private assessments of Darth Malgus's vulnerabilities, who were already or would eventually be in positions to act on those observations, was not small. He had tracked it. He had names. He had specific scenarios, war-gamed with the same precision he brought to military operations, in which Alina was used against him, and he could not prevent it. Not because he was incapable of preventing it in the moment, because preventing it in the moment would require him to be somewhere specific at a time that had been chosen by someone else, and arriving at a time and place chosen by an enemy in order to protect something they had correctly identified as your vulnerability is the definition of losing before the engagement begins. He knew this. He had always known this. The logic had been correct from the beginning. He searched for the right word and rejected the obvious ones, postponing it, treating the postponement as management, telling himself that the risk was being managed because he was aware of it. He had run this same analysis on other commanders. He had watched other people confuse awareness with management and had filed their confusion as a vulnerability. He had been doing the same thing for years. He was done postponing. He did not tell her. This was a decision, though it did not feel like one. It felt like the absence of something rather than the presence of a choice. He went to her residence in the evening, as he sometimes did, and she was there, and the residence was warm in the specific way of spaces inhabited by someone who pays attention to small comforts. The tea she had developed a preference for leaving its particular smell in the air. She asked him something. He answered. They sat for a while in the silence that had its own texture and its own weight. He looked at her. She looked at him, at the mask, at the face that was machinery now, at the thing that had replaced what she had known before Alderaan. She had never, across all the years since the surgery, looked at it with anything that registered as pity or discomfort. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, with interest, as if it was still, despite everything, genuinely interesting to her. He held this for a moment, then he left. The room was not the empty room in the lower district. It was a different room, a room in his own compound, functional, private, the kind of space that appears in no records and serves no official purpose, and exists because significant people require spaces that serve no official purpose. He stood in it. The respirator breathed. The logic was correct. He had confirmed it one final time on the walk from her residence to here, running it again with the precision of someone who needs to be certain, not because they doubt the conclusion, but because the conclusion requires a foundation that will not shift later. It was correct. It had always been correct. There was no gap, no flaw, no place where a different answer emerged. He stood in the room. The respirator breathed. What happens next is private in a way that even this account cannot fully enter. What can be said, what the record of his subsequent actions confirms, what the absence of her from everything that follows makes clear, is that Malgus made the third decision with the same precision he brought to everything else. Not in rage, not with the performance of Sith ritual or the theatrical darkness of a tradition that had built mythology around exactly this kind of act. In grief, in the specific, cold, quiet grief of a man who has identified the correct answer to a question he would have preferred not to be asked, and has answered it, and has done so with his own hands, because he understood correctly, with the accuracy that defined him, that to assign it to anyone else would be to make Alina into something that could be discussed, could be filed, could exist in a record somewhere that an enemy might eventually find. He did it himself because it was the last private thing, the last thing that belonged only to them. After, the room was very quiet. The respirator breathed. It filled the silence the way it always filled silence. Mechanically, precisely, without variation, without the small adjustments and unconscious rhythms of a living thing breathing on its own terms. It breathed, and the silence it filled was larger than the room, larger than the compound, larger than Drummond Cass with its storms and its ancient thunder. He stood in it. He did not move for a long time, and when he moved, finally, and walked out of the room and into the corridor and back into everything that came after, he was carrying nothing. Nothing that could be reached. Nothing that could be used. Nothing that an enemy could find and press against until something gave way. He had made himself unopposable. He had made himself empty. He would discover in the years that followed that these two things were the same thing. The fortress on Ilum was built for permanence, not for comfort, not for the performance of power that the Sith tradition preferred, the deliberate theatricality of spaces designed to make visitors feel small. It was built for function, for duration, for the specific requirements of an operation that intended to outlast the opposition to it. The stone was Ilum's own blue-white crystal formations, reinforced with imperial durasteel, the combination producing walls that were simultaneously ancient and deliberate, as if the planet itself had been consulted and had agreed to participate. Malgus had chosen it for this quality. He had chosen everything about this enterprise for the same quality, with the cold precision of a man who has removed from himself everything that could distort the calculation, who has paid the cost of clarity in advance and intends to use what he purchased. The declaration had been made. The Splinter Empire was a fact. The worlds that had come under his banner were real worlds with real populations and real administrative requirements, and the machinery he had built to manage them was functioning with the efficiency he had designed into it. He was, by any measurable standard, an emperor. He sat in the throne room and listened to the fortress breathe around him. The throne room was described by the commanders who entered it as imposing. Malgus experienced it primarily as sound. The respirator, first, always the baseline against which everything else was measured. Then the fortress itself, the distant hum of systems maintaining the structure against Ilum's cold. The specific acoustics of a large stone chamber that carried footsteps from 3 corridors away and delivered them altered, flattened, stripped of the personality that footsteps carry in smaller spaces. The wind outside, which on Ilum was not the damp constant pressure of Drom and Kars, but something sharper and more intermittent, arriving in gusts that the walls absorbed mostly, but not entirely, leaving a residue of sound in the upper registers of the chamber's ambient noise. He had learned the fortress by its sounds before he had learned it by sight. He knew when the morning shift changed in the lower barracks by the specific quality of movement that travelled through the stone. He knew when the hangar was receiving a new arrival before any report reached him, because the hangar's ventilation system changed pitch under increased load in a way that was audible if you were listening from the throne room. He was always listening. The throne itself was functional. Stone, not the ornate construction that the Sith tradition built for its rulers. No inlaid metals, no carved symbols of dominion, no deliberate elevation above the chamber floor to enforce the geometry of hierarchy. He had specified this. A seat. Adequate. The point was not the seat. He sat in it and listened to the fortress and waited for the first audience of the day. The Cathar commander's name was Vesha. Not Sereth, a different one, younger. Her career built in the margins of the galactic conflict, where alien warriors found the only opportunities available to them in a galaxy that had organized itself around their exclusion. She had come to his banner with 40 fighters and a small ship, and the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a particular offer without knowing they were waiting for it. She entered the throne room with the posture of someone who has spent their entire military career performing deference to people who had not earned it, and who is experiencing, for the first time, a situation in which the performance may not be required. She stopped at the appropriate distance. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You know what I am building," he said. Not a question. "Yes, my lord. Tell me what you think it is." A pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. The difference is audible if you know what to listen for. She was deciding how honest to be. She arrived at fully honest, which was the correct decision. "An empire that doesn't waste what it has," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. She swore loyalty with the specific dignity of someone who has been offered something they had stopped expecting to be offered. Not gratitude. Dignity does not express itself as gratitude. It expresses itself as the straightening of posture, the meeting of eyes, the quality of presence that a person produces when they are being treated as what they actually are, rather than what the dominant structure has decided they are permitted to be. He received her oath. He noted, with the part of him that still noted things without acting on them, that she reminded him of no one. This was important. He had been watching for this. The tendency to see in his alien recruits the ghost of a specific face, the projection of a specific quality onto people who were themselves, and not echoes of someone he had made gone. He had been watching for it the way you watch for a bias in a calculation, because a bias in a calculation produces errors that compound. Vesha was herself. She was not an echo. He filed this with something that was not quite relief. The Sith apprentice arrived mid-morning. Young. Human. The specific kind of ambitious that has identified its goal clearly and is moving toward it with the focused energy of someone who has not yet discovered that a rival tends to revise the goal. He wanted to be here. He had maneuvered to be here, left the Emperor's academy, navigated the political complications of aligning with a declared rebel, accepted the risks of this particular choice, with the calculation of someone who believes he has correctly assessed the odds. He was impressive. Malgus assessed him in the first 30 seconds and confirmed this. The force sensitivity was significant. The training was solid. The intelligence behind the ambition was real rather than performed. He was not pretending to be capable. He was capable, and the ambition was the natural consequence of capability that has identified a direction. He made his case for himself with the precision of someone who has rehearsed it and has had the discipline to rehearse it until the rehearsal disappeared, and only the argument remained. Malgus listened to all of it. Then, why did you leave? The apprentice paused. My lord, the Emperor's academy. Your position there. You had a trajectory, why did you leave it? Another pause. Longer. This question had not been in the rehearsal. Because the trajectory led somewhere I didn't want to go, he said finally. Malgus looked at him for a moment. That is the correct answer, he said. It is also incomplete. The apprentice waited. The trajectory led somewhere you didn't want to go, Malgus said. Because you understood that the destination was not built for what you actually are. You understood that you would spend your entire career being shaped to fit a structure that was designed before you existed, and will exist after you are gone, and does not require your specific qualities, only your general usefulness. He paused. You came here because you believed this structure might be different. The apprentice said nothing. It is, Malgus said. Whether it remains different depends on whether the people inside it understand why it is different and defend that difference as a principle rather than a preference. He accepted the apprentice into his service. He watched him leave with the specific attention of someone filing a long-term observation, not of the apprentice's capabilities, which were established, but of whether the apprentice understood what he had just been told. He suspected he did. He suspected, also, that understanding it now and understanding it under pressure were different skills, and that the second one would be tested before the structure had time to prove itself. He did not know if there would be time. The aide who brought the coalition news was efficient. This was his primary quality. Not intelligence, not strategic insight, but the specific efficiency of someone who delivers information completely and without the editorializing that makes information harder to use. He presented the intelligence on the forming Republic Imperial Coalition with the clean precision of a man who understands that his role is transmission, not interpretation. The coalition was real. Both governments, setting aside the Cold War's managed tensions to address the specific problem of Malgus's Splinter Empire. The Republic providing certain assets, the Empire providing others. The operational timeline was not yet confirmed, but the intelligence suggested it was closer than the fortress's current defensive posture accounted for. Malgus listened to all of it. Then he asked a question. How many of the Imperial commanders in the coalition served at Coruscant? The aide paused. This was not a question the intelligence brief addressed. I don't have that information, my lord. Find it. The aide nodded and withdrew. The question was never answered. The aide did not have access to the relevant records, and the events that followed did not leave space for the research. What the question meant, Malgus did not explain, then or after. What it meant was this. He wanted to know how many of the people coming to end him had been there when the temple burned. How many had been in the smoke, had been offered tihar, had watched him set it aside. How many of them had built their careers in the decades since on the foundation of what he had done that day. He wanted to know if any of them understood what they were doing. If any of them felt the specific irony of it, the man who opened the war being ended by a coalition of the war's beneficiaries. He did not expect the answer to change anything. He simply wanted to know. The throne room was empty by the time the last footsteps faded down the corridor. He remained. The fortress settled around him in its sounds, the systems, the wind, the distant evidence of several hundred people going about the operations he had designed and they were executing. All of it functioning. All of it real. The Empire was not theoretical. It was not a declaration and a dream. It was a working structure, with working parts and genuine momentum. He had built it. He sat in it and listened to it work, and waited for the feeling that he had been, somewhere in the construction of this, waiting for. It did not arrive. This was not surprising. He had understood, in the room on Drummond Cast after the temple, that arrival tends to be smaller than the working toward. He had confirmed this on the upper platform above Coruscant's endless city. He had filed it as a structural feature of the way he was built, that the goals served primarily as direction, and that the direction was the functional thing, and that the arrival was simply where the direction stopped. The direction had stopped. He was here. The throne room was what it was, stone and sound and the respirator marking its rhythm in the stillness. The Empire was what it was. Real, functioning, premised on an efficiency that was also underneath the efficiency, premised on something he had not built into any of the official documentation. The memory of what it felt like when someone looked at you with genuine interest. Not at your power, not at your title, not at the mask or what the mask represented or what the mask protected. At you. He had built an empire that offered alien warriors the dignity of being seen as what they actually were, rather than what the dominant structure permitted them to be. He had built this with the hands that had made seeing him impossible. He sat with this. Not as irony, he did not have the distance from it that irony requires. As fact. As the specific fact of a man who has arrived at the thing he constructed and found that the construction and the cost are the same object, looked at from different angles. The respirator breathed. The fortress worked around him. Somewhere in the lower levels, Vesha was meeting with her officers. The apprentice was in the training rooms. The aide was attempting to locate records that did not exist in any form accessible to him. Everything was functioning. Everything was hollow in the way of things that have been built to last and have nothing left inside them that requires protection. He sat in the throne room until the fortress's sounds became the only thing in the room, until the distinction between the room and the silence collapsed into the breathing, until the breathing was the only evidence that the throne was occupied. And then he remained, even after that, because there was nowhere else to go, because he had built this place as the destination, and he was in it, and the destination was a stone room and a machine and the distant sound of people executing the design of a man who had removed from himself everything that could reach him. Everything that could reach him was gone. He was unreachable. He sat in the perfection of this and breathed through the machine and listened to the fortress and did not move. Outside, Ilum's wind arrived in one of its intermittent gusts and pressed against the walls, and the walls absorbed it, and the throne room received only the residue, the faintest alteration in the upper registers of the ambient sound, present for a moment, and then gone. He heard it. He heard everything. It was the only thing left that he was certain of. What follows is not his account. He left no account. What exists are fragments, reports, observations, the recorded impressions of people who were present in his orbit during the final period and who survived it. History assembled from witnesses is always incomplete. It is also, sometimes, more accurate than the thing itself would have been. This is what the witnesses said. His name was Arik. Cathar. 12 years of service in forces that had never once offered him a rank commensurate with his ability, because his ability was not the relevant variable in the systems he had served. He joined Malgus's empire in its 4th month. He was not the first. He was not the most decorated or the most strategically significant. He was one of several hundred alien warriors who arrived in that period from various origins and various degrees of desperation and various calibrations of hope, all of them responding to the same offer. The first offer any galactic power had made them that did not require them to be less than what they were in order to accept it. He has been asked, in the years since, what Malgus was like. He finds the question difficult to answer accurately. He was a sound, Arik says, when pressed. Before you saw him, the breathing, you learned it Everyone in the fortress learned it, and after a while it became information. The way weather is information. You heard it coming down a corridor, and you knew where he was and where he was going, and how much time you had before he arrived. This is offered not as complaint, as fact. He was not cruel, Arik says. People who describe him as cruel were not there. Cruel is something you perform. He did not perform anything. He was simply present. Completely present, in a way that most people are not most of the time. When his attention was on you, you felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not threatening. True. There was one briefing. Arik was present for it. A tactical briefing, mid-campaign. The coalition's movements being assessed against the fortress's defensive options. 8 commanders around a table. Malgus at the head of it. A decision point arrived. A specific tactical question with 2 available responses, each with clear implications. The kind of choice that should resolve quickly in a room with a decisive commander. Malgus paused. Not long. 4 seconds. Perhaps 5. In the context of a military briefing, 5 seconds of the senior commander not responding is an unusual interval. The room went still. Arik has thought about this stillness many times since. He does not believe it was fear. He has been in rooms that went still from fear, and the quality is different, has a specific texture of held breath and averted eyes. This was different. It was like watching someone listen to something we couldn't hear, he says, and we all went quiet, so we wouldn't interrupt it. Then Malgus gave the decision. Clearly. Completely. The meeting continued. Arik never found out what the 5-second pause contained. He has a theory. He has kept the theory private, because it is not the kind of theory that belongs in an operational debrief, and because, also, it feels like it belongs to Malgus specifically, and not to anyone who is simply in the room. The theory is this. In those 5 seconds, Malgus was not calculating. He was remembering something. And then, he set it aside, and gave the decision, and the Empire continued its work. He believed in what he built, Arik says finally, when the question about what Malgus was like has been asked enough times that he has found the answer that is most accurate. Not the way you believe in something that makes you feel good. The way you believe in something you have already paid for. Something you cannot unbuy. You defend it differently when you've paid that way. You don't defend it because you think you'll win. A pause. You defend it because it is the proof that the cost meant something. Her name was Marshal Ben. Colonel. Coalition Operational Planning, assigned to the working group responsible for the tactical assessment of Malgus's Splinter Empire, and the development of the interdiction strategy that would eventually become the assault on Ilum. She had studied his record for 3 years before the coalition formed. Her assessment, filed formally and available in the Republic Military Archive, runs to 67 pages. The summary is 14 lines. The relevant line, the one that was read by 17 different officers across both the Republic and Imperial sides of the coalition, and discussed by none of them, is this. Subject demonstrates a consistent pattern of protecting assets and individuals beyond the requirements of tactical efficiency. Pattern is not random. Pattern has not been fully explained by available intelligence. She had identified it 2 years into her study. The first instance she flagged was Zeost's margin, the Cathar commander's unexplained survival, the absence of official documentation, the clean gap in the record that was too clean to be accidental. She noted it. She set it beside other instances, smaller ones, less dramatic, moments in Malgus's operational history where a variable had been preserved that did not need preserving, where a resource had been expended protecting something the strategic calculus did not require protection for. The pattern was real. She was certain of this. She was not certain what it meant. She included it in the report without analysis, because she had a rule about including patterns she could not explain. You include them, you note that you cannot explain them, and you let the people reading the report decide whether the explanation matters. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the unexplained pattern is the most important thing in the document, and everyone who reads it decides, for their own reasons, that it belongs to someone else to pursue. 17 officers read this line. None of them pursued it. She has wondered about this. In the years since Ilum, not with regret, she is a precise thinker. and she understands that the coalition's objective was achieved, and that the unexplained pattern did not affect the outcome. She wonders about it as a question, as the kind of question that has no operational relevance and therefore belongs entirely to her, to carry around in the part of her mind reserved for things that are finished and still somehow not resolved. What was he protecting? She knows, at this point, about Elara Daru. The historical record has assembled enough fragments that the outline of the relationship is visible, even if the interior of it remains inaccessible. She knows the timeline. She knows what he did, and roughly when. What she cannot reconcile is the pattern continuing after. He removed the vulnerability. The logic was sound. She would have made the same assessment in his position, she thinks. And then she thinks perhaps she would not have. And then she thinks this is the wrong question. The pattern continued after Elara. He kept protecting things he didn't need to protect, which means the protection was never about the strategic vulnerability, which means, and this is the place where her thinking stops every time at this specific threshold, which means she does not know what it was about. She has a hypothesis. She has kept it out of every official document, because it is not the kind of hypothesis that belongs in official documents. The hypothesis is that he was practicing, that every unnecessary protection was a rehearsal for something he had stopped being able to do directly, that the pattern was the residue of something that had been removed from him, and which kept, despite the removal, despite everything, finding its way back into his decisions. She does not know if this is true. She closed the file. She opened it again. She closed it again, permanently, and moved on to other work. The question stayed. He has not given his name to any record associated with this account. This is respected. He served Malgus for 8 months, from the declaration through to the final weeks before Ilum. He was, in his own assessment, a good apprentice, attentive, capable, sufficiently ambitious to be useful, and sufficiently disciplined to keep the ambition from becoming a distraction. He watched Malgus the way apprentices watch masters, which is to say, constantly, and from angles the master may not have been aware of, looking for the seam between the legend and the person. Every master has this seam. Every person does. The legend is the surface, the public construction, the thing that has been assembled over time from decisions and reputations, and the accumulated weight of what others have projected onto you. The person is underneath. The seam is where the two don't quite meet. He found it. It was small. He found it in the throne room on a morning when the fortress was quiet, the coalition not yet at its final stage, the daily operations proceeding, the empire in the steady functioning state that had become its normal rhythm. He had entered the throne room for a scheduled briefing and arrived 3 minutes early, which he had calculated as the correct margin, not so early as to be intrusive, early enough to demonstrate attentiveness. Malgus was already there. He was seated in the throne, facing the viewport that looked out onto Elam's crystal formations, and he was not doing anything, not reviewing data, not conducting the internal assessments that he often conducted during what appeared to be stillness, not preparing for the briefing or managing any of the operational threads that ran constantly through the Empire's daily requirements. He was looking at the crystals. Ilum's crystal formations catch light in a specific way. The planet's surface is covered in them, blue-white, enormous, and when the light hits at certain angles, they produce a quality of reflection that has no equivalent on most inhabited worlds. It is not beautiful in the conventional sense. It is something more disorienting than beautiful. The light fractured and multiplied and returned from angles that don't correspond to the angles it entered, the crystals reordering the world's illumination into something that follows different rules. Malgus was looking at this. For how long the apprentice did not know. He stood at the threshold and did not enter and did not announce himself, which he understood was a breach of protocol, and which he did not care about in this specific moment, because something about the quality of what he was witnessing felt like it belonged to Malgus, and should not be. Interrupted by protocol. He waited. After perhaps a minute, Malgus said, without turning, without any indication that he had been aware of the apprentice's presence, "Come in." The briefing proceeded normally. The apprentice never mentioned what he had seen. Not in any report, not to any colleague, not in any of the accounts he has contributed to the historical record of this period. He has been asked why. He finds this question easier to answer than most. Because it was his, he says. Whatever it was, whatever he was doing, whatever he was looking at in those crystals, it was the only thing I ever saw that was entirely his. Not the empires, not the traditions, not the emperor he was rebelling against, or the legacy he was building, or the machine he was wearing on his face. A pause. I don't know what he was thinking about. I have a feeling about it. I've kept the feeling to myself for the same reason I didn't interrupt him. Some things you protect, not because they're strategically valuable. He stops here. He does not finish the sentence. He does not need to. The file was routine. This is worth stating because routine files are the ones that receive the least attention and sometimes contain the most significant details, and the people who review them are usually reviewing 40 other files simultaneously and have developed, necessarily, a skill for rapid triage that occasionally discards things it should retain. The officer's name was Sen. Imperial Intelligence, assigned to the Communications Analysis Division that processed intercepted transmissions from Malgus's Splinter Empire. Her job was pattern identification, not strategic assessment, not operational planning. Patterns. Anomalies, things that appeared in the data that did not fit the established model of how the subject communicated and operated. She found the honorific in the third week of her assignment to the file. It appeared in private communications, not the official command channels, not the recorded audiences, not any of the documented interactions that had been formally logged by the fortress's administrative systems. The private channels. The ones that were harder to intercept and that therefore received less analytical attention than their importance warranted. The honorific was Twi'lek. She recognized it as Twi'lek because she had done a rotation in a mid-rim posting with a significant Twi'lek population and had learned enough of the language to manage basic interactions, which included learning the honorific register, the specific words and forms that Twi'lek speakers use to address people they consider family, not colleagues, not superiors, not allies or subordinates or any of the categories that military and political hierarchies organize people into. Family. Malgus used this honorific when addressing certain alien commanders. Not all of them. Specific ones she cross-referenced, because cross-referencing was her function, and found no consistent pattern in rank or species or operational role that explained the selection. The commanders who received it were not distinguished from the ones who did not by anything in their official files. She noted the honorific. She noted that it appeared only in private communications. She noted that it had no explanation in any of the documentation she had access to. She set it aside and continued with the file. 3 days later, she returned to it. She did not return to it because it had operational relevance. It did not, or if it did, the relevance was not visible from her position in the analytical chain. She returned to it because something about it had stayed with her in the way that certain details stay with you, not because they are important in any measurable sense, but because they are the kind of true thing that does not resolve into an explanation. She looked at the honorific again. She thought about the Twi'lek language's honorific register, about what it means, in that register, to use family address for someone who is not family, about the specific intentionality of that usage. It is not a casual error, not a slip of register. In Twi'lek, the honorific is chosen deliberately, because it means something specific, because it is offered as a recognition rather than a classification. She thought about who might have taught him that word. She did not have enough information to complete this thought. She closed the file. She paused with her hand on the closure. She opened it again. She looked at the honorific one more time, its specific form, its specific context, the private channel it had traveled through to reach a record that was never supposed to be significant. Then she closed the file permanently and flagged it for standard archival processing and moved to the next item in her queue. She did not note the honorific in her summary report. She told herself this was because it had no operational relevance. This was true. It was also not the reason. The reason was that it felt like something that should remain where it was, in a private channel, in a register meant for family, in the record of a man who had built an empire and filled it with people he called, in a language most of his commanders did not speak, by the word that meant, you are not alone here. She left it there. The file closed. The honorific stayed inside it, private, as it had always been, as perhaps it was always meant to be. He walked the corridors alone, not fleeing, not conducting a final tactical assessment of defensive positions, or calculating the coalition's approach vectors, or doing any of the things that the operational part of him was still capable of doing, and which would have been, by any reasonable measure, the correct use of the time remaining. He walked. The fortress had a sound when it was under assault, a specific quality of vibration that travelled through the stone from the points of contact outward, arriving in the interior corridors as something felt more than heard, a pressure in the walls that the walls absorbed and transmitted. Simultaneously, he had learned this sound in the fortress's first weeks. He had categorized it then as tactical information. Now he let it be what it was. The corridors were mostly empty. The remaining defenders were at their positions. He had placed them correctly. He was certain of this. The defensive geometry was sound even against a force of this size and composition. They would hold for a while, not indefinitely. The coalition had brought enough to be certain of the outcome, which is what you do when you are ending something you want to be certain of ending. He walked past a junction he had walked past several hundred times. He noticed, for the first time, that the left wall at the junction had a crack running diagonally from a point approximately chest height to the floor. Old crack, the stone's natural response to the temperature cycling of Ilum's surface, the freeze and thaw that the fortress's systems managed but could not entirely prevent. He had meant to have it repaired. He had noted it in the first month and assigned it to the maintenance queue, and then the Empire had continued its work, and the crack had remained, and now here it was, still diagonal, still unrepaired, permanent in the way of things that were never quite urgent enough. He looked at it for a moment. Then he continued walking. The viewport was in a corridor on the structure's eastern side. He had found it in the Empire's first weeks, during a night when the administrative requirements of a functioning government had kept him working past deep dark, and he had walked the fortress afterward the way he sometimes walked, not with destination, not with purpose, simply moving through the space to know it completely. The viewport faced east, which on Ilum meant it faced the largest of the crystal formations, a field of them, several kilometers across, the crystals ranging from the height of a person to the height of a building, blue-white and enormous, and entirely indifferent to being looked at. At a specific hour, the early storm rise equivalent on Ilum, when the planet's dim sun crested the horizon at the particular angle that Ilum's axial tilt produced, the light hit the crystal field directly. What the crystals did with it was not describable in the language of tactical assessment. He had stood at this viewport on that first night and watched the light in the crystals and had not moved for a long time, and had not explained to himself why he was not moving, and had not needed to. He stood at it now. The light was not at its best angle. The hour was wrong. The assault's timing had not been organized around Ilum's sunrise. The crystals caught what light was available and returned it in their fractured way, the formations reordering the illumination into something that followed different rules than the illumination that had entered. It was still the best light in the structure. He stood at the viewport and looked at the crystal field and breathed, the machine breathing, the rhythm unchanged, the same mechanical precision it had maintained since the medical chamber above Alderaan, since the first moment the seal closed and the respirator took over the simple work of keeping him alive. He breathed and looked at the crystals. He did not think about the coalition. He did not think about the Empire, or the throne room, or the three audiences, or the tactical geometry of the defensive positions he had placed his remaining forces in. He stood at the viewport and was, for a moment that had no strategic value and produced no useful conclusion, simply present in the light. Then the vibration in the walls changed quality. He turned from the viewport and walked toward it. The confrontation happened in the fortress's central chamber. He did not choose this location tactically. He arrived there because the coalition's forces were moving through the fortress with the organized efficiency of a well-planned operation, and the central chamber was where the corridors converged, and therefore where he would encounter them first if he continued walking in the direction he was. He continued walking in the direction he was walking. They came with numbers. This is what you bring when you are ending something you want to be certain of ending. Republic forces and Imperial forces, operating with the specific coordinated efficiency of two militaries that have spent decades learning each other's methods, and have, for this operation, set that knowledge aside and produced something new from the combination. He assessed this in the first seconds and found it genuinely impressive. He fought the way he had always fought. Not with rage. He had never fought with rage, had always understood rage as a variable that introduced error into the calculation, not with the performance of a Sith Lord demonstrating power to subordinates or enemies who needed to be reminded of the hierarchy. With clarity, with the absolute, complete clarity of a man doing the most honest thing he knows how to do. The clarity that had been present since the Academy courtyard on Dromund Kaas, since the first training bout, since the first time he understood that combat was the one context in which all variables resolved into something true. He had spent his entire life looking for this clarity in other places, in ideology, in command, in the architecture of an empire built on the ghost of a principle. He had found it here. He had always found it here. The coalition's forces were enough. The moment of understanding arrived not dramatically, not as a single blow or a decisive turn in the engagement, but as an accumulation. The specific accumulation of a man who has been paying attention his entire life and is paying attention now and understands, through the quality of what he is receiving, that the variables have resolved in a direction that cannot be altered. He understood. He held the understanding. What arrived with it was not fear. He had categorized fear as a young man and had spent decades maintaining the categorization, and the category had not changed. Not regret. Regret requires a belief that a different sequence of decisions was available, and he had always known that the sequence was what it was, each step reasonable, each exit closing naturally behind it, each inevitability created by the thing before it. Something else. Something quiet, and without a name in any language he had learned. Something that felt, and he did not reach for this. It simply arrived, the way true things arrive, like the clearing of a variable that had been pending for a very long time. He had been the man in the medical chamber, learning the sound of the machine. He had been the boy in the courtyard, watching lightning. He had been the person at the viewport above Alderaan, learning the face in the reflection. He had been all of these simultaneously, always, underneath everything, and the being of all of them at once had been the weight he carried, and the weight was almost. The respirator stopped. This is stated plainly because plainness is what the moment deserves. It stopped. The rhythm that had been present since the medical chamber above Alderaan, since the first mechanical exhale in the quiet room with the flat light, the rhythm that had travelled through 10 years of campaigns and Cold War and rebellion and an empire built on the ghost of a principle, stopped. The silence it left was specific. Not empty silence. Not the absence of sound. The fortress still had its sounds. The coalition's forces still moved through the corridors. Illume's wind still pressed against the exterior walls. The silence was specific to the rhythm that had stopped. The specific silence of a particular sound's ending. The silence that a sound leaves behind it when it has been present long enough that the surrounding world has organized itself around it without knowing. The Force felt it. This cannot be verified. The narrator acknowledges this directly, and without apology. There is no instrument that measures what the Force registers, no record that captures what the living current that runs through all things experiences when something that has pressed against it for decades stops pressing. But there are accounts, from Force-sensitive individuals present in the fortress, from Jedi and Sith alike who were in the central chamber or its adjacent corridors in the moments after, of a specific quality of change, not dramatic. Not the surge or the collapse that the more theatrical traditions would assign to the passing of a significant Force user. Something quieter, the way a room feels when a sound you didn't know you were tracking finally stops. The specific quality of a silence that arrives with the texture of something that was there and is now not there, and you realize you had been listening to it all along. Beneath everything, beneath every other sound in every room you had been in together. That, the Force felt that. The aftermath was what aftermaths are. The coalition secured the fortress with the efficient thoroughness of forces that have been told to leave nothing unexamined. Reports were filed. Positions were inventoried. The Empire's administrative machinery, the functioning, genuine, operational machinery of a real government, was assessed and mostly dismantled, some portions absorbed into the structures of the powers that had ended it. Arek and the alien soldiers who had served in the Splinter Empire were processed according to the Coalition's applicable protocols. Some returned to the systems they had come from. Some found their way into other service. The specific dignity that Malgus had offered them, the recognition of being what they were without requiring them to be less, did not disappear with the Empire. It had been given. Given things do not disappear when the giver does. They continue in the people who received them, changed and carried forward. The fortress was examined by several parties over the following months. The viewport on the eastern corridor was noted in a survey document as structurally sound and of no strategic significance. The crack in the wall at the junction was repaired. The intelligence file, SENS file, the one with the Twi'lek honorific in the private communications, was formally reviewed as part of the post-operation archival process. The honorific was flagged for redaction on the grounds of operational irrelevance. The flag was approved. The redaction was processed. Sen kept a handwritten copy. She wrote it on a small card, the honorific itself, its transliteration, a brief notation of the context in which it appeared. She put it in a drawer in her personal quarters. She did not label it. She did not explain it to anyone who asked what it was, which was no one, because no one knew it was there. She kept it for the rest of her career. She never explained why. The final image is not the fortress. It is not Ilum or the crystal formations or the viewport and its specific light. It is a night on Alderaan that no longer exists. The planet is still green in this image, still cloud-covered, still proceeding according to its own logic, the logic that has nothing to do with the wars that have been fought above it, and the battles that have broken faces, and the treaties that have been signed in corridors by people who were not invited to the ceremony. 2 people on a low ridge above an encampment, not touching, not speaking. The stars above them enormous, more than you expect, more than feels reasonable. The sky doing something that skies on other planets simply do not do. She points. She names 3 of them. The names are not imperial designations. They are something older, softer, in a register that belongs to her specifically and to the language her mother spoke. He listens to all 3 names. Then, how do you know those? A moment of quiet. My mother taught me. And then neither of them says anything for a long time, and the silence between them has weight and texture and warmth, and the air of Alderaan is genuinely clean, and he breathes it, simply, without assistance, his own breath rising and falling in the dark, with all its small variations, its unconscious adjustments, its ordinary and unremarkable aliveness. He breathes. She sits beside him. The stars hold their positions. There is no record of what he called her when no one was listening. There may never be. Some things the war did not take. They were simply set aside in a room where no one could reach them. And maybe that is the only mercy in any of this. That something was set aside, and that it remained.